At 5:15 a.m., the silence of my living room was shattered by a phone call that would change everything. The caller ID flashed "Mother," but the voice on the other end wasn't a grieving daughter. It was a woman claiming a victory. "It's over, Emily," she said, her voice trembling, not with sadness but with excitement. "The old man is finally gone. I've already called the brokers. The manor is mine. I get everything, you get nothing." She laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed through the receiver. She thought she was delivering my eviction notice. She thought she was speaking to a defeated daughter who had finally been cut out of the will. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply pressed the speaker button and smiled. Because my mother made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed she knew who was in the room with me. Sitting right there in his favorite armchair holding a steaming cup of tea and a sealed lawyer's envelope was my grandfather. He wasn't dead. He was very much alive, tears streaming down his face as he listened to his own daughter celebrate his death. And in the corner of the room, the red light of a security camera was blinking, recording every single word of her betrayal. What she thought was her victory speech had just become her confession. If you think you know how messy family drama can get, you have no idea what's coming. This isn't just a story about a greedy mother. It is a masterclass in how to let a villain destroy themselves. Watch until the very end, because the trap we sprang on her wasn't just revenge, it was justice. My name is Emily Vance. I am 34 years old, a curriculum manager for a quiet suburban school district, and for most of my life I have been the invisible member of the Vance family dynasty. While my mother Margaret chased charity galas, board memberships, and the approval of high society, I was the one who remembered birthdays, managed doctor appointments, and knew exactly which herbal tea settled my grandfather's stomach. I was raised to be useful, not seen, a trait that my mother exploited until the moment she decided I was no longer necessary. But invisibility has its advantages. People often forget that you are watching, and they certainly forget that silence can be the loudest weapon of all. It was the dead of winter, and the world outside my frosted window was pitch black. The silence in my small rented bungalow was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the soft hiss of the radiator fighting against the chill. Then, at exactly 5:15 a.m., the silence was shattered. My phone buzzed violently against the coffee table, the screen lighting up the dark room with a single demanding word: "Mother." She wasn't calling to check on me. She was calling from the Sanctuary, a 5-star wellness resort in Arizona, where she had been detoxing for the past week. In reality, she was hiding while her scheme played out. I answered, bracing myself. Her voice wasn't groggy with sleep. It was electric, vibrating with a manic energy that usually signaled she had just crushed a business rival. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She just launched into her victory speech. She believed that while she was sipping cucumber water in the desert, her lawyers had successfully executed an emergency order of incapacity against my grandfather, forcing him into a state facility under the guise of medical necessity. "It's done, Emily," she purred, the sound of ice clinking in a glass audible in the background. "I just got the confirmation email from the agency. The old man is out. The locks on the manor are being changed as we speak." She didn't wait for a response. She began listing the assets she was going to liquidate, as if she were reading a grocery list. The vintage Jaguar he had restored by hand, the Impressionist art collection, and finally the crown jewel, the manor itself. "I've already texted the realtor," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "I'm listing it for $2 million over market value. Someone will buy it for the history alone. I get everything, Emily. Finally. And you? Well, you get your freedom from playing nursemaid. You get nothing else, of course, but you're used to that." My hand didn't shake. My heart didn't race. A strange, cold calm had settled over me, the kind of calm that comes when you realize the person you feared is actually just small and pathetic. I didn't hold the phone to my ear. I placed it gently on the wooden table between two ceramic mugs. I pressed the speaker button. The room was so quiet that the static on the line sounded like a roar. I looked at the phone, then I looked across the table. "Are you sure you want to do this, Mother?" I asked softly, my voice steady. "There is no going back from this. Once you sell his home, you destroy his legacy. Is that really what you want?" It was the bait, and she swallowed it whole. "His legacy?" She scoffed, her laugh harsh and jagged, piercing the morning air. "His legacy is a dusty old money pit and a lifetime of judging me. He was a stubborn, tight-fisted old burden, Emily. He should have died 10 years ago. I'm not destroying his legacy, I'm cashing it out. I deserve this. I've waited 50 years for him to get out of the way. I don't care if he rots in that facility as long as he signs the checks." I didn't look at the phone anymore. I looked at the man sitting in the armchair directly across from me. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, was not in a state facility. He was not incapacitated. He was wearing his favorite wool cardigan, sitting upright, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of Earl Grey tea. He had arrived at my house late last night, escaping the very trap my mother had set for him with the help of a loyal family attorney. He was frail, yes, but his mind was as sharp as a razor. He sat in absolute silence, staring at the glowing phone screen. Tears rolled silently down his weathered cheeks, not tears of fear, but of profound, heartbreaking clarity. He was listening to his only child wish him dead for a payday. Grandfather looked up at me. The pain in his eyes was unbearable, but behind the grief, there was a steel resolve I hadn't seen in years. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Cut it," he mouthed. But before I reached for the button, my eyes flicked to the bookshelf behind him. There, nestled between two leather-bound encyclopedias, was a small black device, a high-definition security camera. My mother had installed it months ago, claiming she needed it to monitor Dad's confusion for his own safety. She had insisted on it, connecting it to the cloud account she thought only she controlled. Now the tiny red light blinked rhythmically in the shadows. Blink, blink, blink. It was recording every syllable of her venom. It was recording the sound of her laughing at his imagined demise. She had built the surveillance system to prove he was incompetent, but instead she was providing irrefutable proof of her own moral bankruptcy. "Goodbye, Mother," I whispered. I tapped the red icon to end the call. The silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. Grandfather let out a long, shaky breath, setting his tea down with a trembling hand. "I needed to know Emily," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "I kept hoping I was wrong about her. I kept making excuses." He wiped his face with a handkerchief, his posture straightening as the grief hardened into purpose. "Now I can rest, because now I know exactly what I have to do." My mother hung up the phone, thinking she had just declared victory. She didn't know she had just recorded her own confession. Grandfather passed away quietly later that same afternoon, still sitting in his armchair by the window, watching the winter sun dip below the horizon. There was no pain, no panic, only the profound relief of a man who finally understood the truth and had made his peace with it. As the paramedics wheeled him out of my small bungalow, I didn't feel the crushing weight of despair I had expected. Instead, I felt a fierce, burning protectiveness. For 34 years, I had been the invisible granddaughter, the quiet fixer who existed in the background of the Vance family drama. While my mother, Margaret, was the radiant star who demanded the orbit of everyone around her, I was the one who watered the roots. I managed grandfather's medications, cooked his meals, and listened to his stories about the war, while Margaret only visited when she needed a signature on a check or a photo opportunity for her social media. She viewed my devotion not as love, but as a lack of ambition, a pathetic willingness to serve. She often told her friends right in front of me that I had a servant's heart, a compliment that was always delivered with a sneer. She never understood that love is in the details, in the daily grind of care, not in the grand gestures made when an audience is watching. That dynamic had reached its breaking point 5 years ago, in a memory that kept playing on a loop in my mind, as I sat in the funeral home making arrangements. It was the day the family assets were prematurely divided, a day Margaret had orchestrated with the precision of a military coup. We were gathered in the mahogany-paneled library of the manor, the sprawling Victorian estate that had been in the Vance family for 4 generations. Grandfather was healthier then, but Margaret was relentless. She had convinced him that estate taxes would decimate his legacy if he didn't transfer the deeds immediately. She paced the room like a tigress, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood, outlining a plan that was blatantly self-serving. She demanded the manor. She wanted the house, the contents, the grounds, and the prestige that came with the address. It was a property valued at over $4 million, a symbol of old money and power. Grandfather had hesitated, his pen hovering over the documents, his eyes darting to me. He wanted to be fair. He wanted to leave me something substantial, but Margaret was ready for that. She pulled a second folder from her briefcase, tossing it onto the table with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Give her the Marsh, Dad," she had said, her voice dripping with false practicality. "It's 10 acres, plenty of space. It's fair." The Marsh was a joke in our town, a low-lying, waterlogged tract of land on the outskirts of the county, choked with weeds, cattails, and clouds of mosquitoes. It was a piece of property Grandfather had bought decades ago for pennies on a whim, and it had sat untouched and unloved ever since. It was a burden, not a gift. When Grandfather protested, saying it wasn't equal to the estate, Margaret had turned to me, her eyes cold and hard. "Oh, stop it. Emily loves nature, don't you, dear? You're always digging in the dirt. You fit in better with the mud anyway. The manor requires upkeep, sophistication, money, things Emily doesn't have. The Marsh is low maintenance, like her." I saw the pain on Grandfather's face, the rising tide of an argument that would leave him exhausted and defeated. So I did what I always did. I saved him. I reached out, took the pen, and smiled. "I'll take it, Grandpa," I said. "I like the quiet there." I signed the papers accepting the swamp solely to silence my mother's shouting. Margaret had smirked, signing the deed to the mansion with a flourish, believing she had just robbed me blind. But as I sat in the quiet of the funeral director's office 2 days after Grandfather's death, clutching a thick roll of blueprints I had retrieved from my safety deposit box, the irony was nearly suffocating. Margaret had been so blinded by the visible trappings of wealth, the turrets, the ballroom, the manicured hedges, that she had failed to look at the map of the changing city. She didn't know that for the past 6 months, I had been quietly meeting with the City Planning Commission. While Margaret was detoxing in Arizona, the City Council had finalized a massive urban expansion project. The town was pivoting south toward the river. I unrolled the map on my lap, tracing the bold red lines that now crisscrossed my worthless property. The heavy, mosquito-ridden marshland wasn't just mud anymore. According to the official zoning letter I had received just last week, my 10 acres had been rezoned from agricultural waste to high-density commercial. It was the designated anchor point for the city's new eco-tourism Riverwalk and luxury hotel district. Developers were already sniffing around, sending me letters of intent with numbers that made my head spin, numbers that dwarfed the value of the manor, especially a manor that, unbeknownst to Margaret, was aging poorly and hemorrhaging money in maintenance costs. I rolled the map back up and placed it into my bag, a secret warmth spreading through my chest. I wouldn't tell her, not yet. I would let her play the grand lady of the manor. I would let her preen and boast about her castle, unaware that the kingdom had moved. She thought she had given me a pile of dirt to bury me. She didn't realize she had just handed me a gold mine. The ink on Grandfather's death certificate was barely dry when the invasion began. It was a Tuesday morning, less than 48 hours after he had passed, and I had driven over to the manor seeking a few moments of quiet in the library where we used to read together. Instead of silence, I was greeted by the industrial roar of a dumpster truck backing up the long gravel driveway. A massive steel container, painted a jarring shade of orange, was dropped right onto the pristine front lawn, crushing the hydrangeas Grandfather had tended for 30 years. My stomach turned as I watched a crew of workmen in dusty coveralls emerge from the front door, their arms laden with boxes. They weren't moving furniture out carefully. They were purging. I watched in horror as they tossed armfuls of hardcover books, first editions, history volumes, the leather-bound classics grandfather had cherished into the dumpster like they were nothing more than garbage. I parked my car and ran toward the porch, my grief momentarily replaced by a blinding white-hot rage. Standing in the foyer, directing the chaos like a general on a battlefield, was my mother. She wasn't wearing mourning black. She was dressed in a crisp white linen suit, holding a color swatch palette against the wall. The air inside the house, usually smelling of old paper and cedar, was thick with the chemical sting of paint thinner. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw what the contractors were doing in the main hallway. The hand-carved black walnut paneling, a dark rich wood that had been installed by my great-grandfather in 1920, was being aggressively sanded down. Cans of eggshell white primer sat open on the floor. She was erasing the history of the house, whitewashing the soul of the estate to make it look like every other soulless modern farmhouse in a magazine. "Mother, what are you doing?" I choked out, my voice trembling. "He hasn't even been buried yet." Margaret didn't even turn around. She waved a hand dismissively at a worker near the staircase. "We're modernizing, Emily. No one buys gloomy Victorian haunted houses anymore. I need this place bright and airy for the open house next month. And those books, they smelled like mildew. I'm doing the estate a favor." I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency contact for Mr. Henderson, our family attorney. I was ready to call the police, to file an injunction, to scream until the windows shattered. But before I could dial, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Henderson calling me. He must have been alerted by the neighbors or the noise. I answered, breathless, explaining the carnage happening in front of me. "She's destroying it, Arthur," I whispered, turning away so my mother wouldn't hear. "She's throwing away his life. We have to stop her." Mr. Henderson's voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly precise. "No, Emily," he said firmly. "You must not stop her. Do not intervene. Do not kick the workmen out. Let her paint the wood. Let her throw away the books." I felt like I had been slapped. "Why?" I demanded. "Because of the doctrine of implied acceptance," he explained, his voice low. "If she acts like the owner before the probate is settled, if she renovates, destroys, or moves in, she is legally accepting the asset as is. She is demonstrating intermeddling. By taking dominion over the property, she strips herself of the right to disclaim the inheritance later. She thinks she is claiming a prize, but she is actually signing a contract she hasn't read. Step back, Emily. Let her play house." I stood there for a moment, the phone pressed to my ear, watching a painter slap a thick coat of white primer over the intricate woodwork grandfather had loved. It felt like a physical blow, a violation of everything sacred. But I remembered the swamp. I remembered the long game. I swallowed my scream, turned on my heel, and walked out the door without saying another word to her. I got back in my car and drove away, leaving her to her destruction. My silence only emboldened her. By that evening, the escalation reached its peak. I received a notification on my phone, a text message from Mother. It was a photo of the front door featuring a sleek new digital smart lock where the old brass keyhole had been. Below the photo was a message: "Don't bother coming by to snoop. I've changed the codes. I don't want you stealing anything before the inventory is complete." I stared at the screen, reading the accusation of theft from the woman who was currently stripping the house bare. A few minutes later, I saw a new post on her social media, a link to an upcoming estate auction featuring grandfather's antique writing desk, the very desk where he had taught me to write my name. She was selling it, all confident that she held every card in the deck. She had taken total possession, leaving a paper trail of receipts, contracts, and social media posts that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was the mistress of the manor. She believed she was securing her fortune and locking me out of her kingdom. She changed the locks to keep me out, never suspecting that she had just locked herself inside a burning building. The weekend arrived, and with it came the final spectacle of my mother's delusion. She had titled the event "A Celebration of Life," on the heavy cream-colored cardstock invitations she sent out to the county's elite, but anyone with eyes could see it for what it truly was, a victory lap. The manor, now stripped of its history and painted a blinding sterile white, was lit up like a cruise ship against the dark night sky. Luxury sedans and sports cars lined the long driveway where grandfather's old pickup truck used to park. As I walked up the stone path avoiding the valet stand, I could hear the sounds of a string quartet drifting through the open windows, competing with the raucous laughter of people who had never known Arthur Vance, but who were very eager to know the new wealthy mistress of his estate. I was dressed in a simple, high-necked black dress, the only person in attendance wearing the color of mourning. Inside, the transformation was jarring. The warmth of the house was gone, replaced by rented crystal chandeliers and modern art pieces that looked out of place against the Victorian architecture. In the center of the grand foyer holding court beneath the staircase, she had just desecrated with white paint, was Margaret. She looked nothing like a grieving daughter. She was wearing a shimmering gold-sequined cocktail dress that caught every light in the room, a glass of champagne permanently attached to her hand. I stood in the shadow of the archway for a moment, just watching her work the room. She was in her element, spinning a web of lies so thick it was suffocating. I heard her telling the mayor's wife with a practiced catch in her voice how difficult the last few months had been. He was so confused at the end, poor dear. She sighed loud enough for the circle of admirers to hear. He begged me to take over the estate. He knew he couldn't handle it. I promised him I would restore it to its glory. It's worth nearly $5 million now, you know, with the renovations I've planned. The hypocrisy made my stomach turn. She was basking in the envy of her friends, using my grandfather's death as a social ladder. I took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The room didn't go silent all at once, but a ripple of quiet spread outward from where I stood as people noticed the ghost at the feast. Margaret turned her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of pitying condescension. She didn't come to greet me. She waited for me to walk to her, forcing me to cross the entire length of the foyer under the scrutiny of her guests. When I reached her, she didn't offer a hug. Instead, she pitched her voice to Carrie, ensuring everyone could hear the humiliation she intended to inflict. "Oh, Emily," she said, widening her eyes in mock surprise. "I didn't think you'd actually come. You know the caterers are using the service entrance around the back, don't you? We really don't have anything for you to take today. The donations have already been sent out." A few guests chuckled nervously, uncertain if she was joking. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at the guests, and I didn't look at the walls she had ruined. I looked directly into her eyes, seeing the deep, frantic insecurity buried beneath the gold sequins. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, battered tin box. It wasn't jewelry or money. It was a tin of heirloom tomato seeds, the specific variety grandfather had spent 20 years crossbreeding the ones he had been planning to plant this coming spring. It was the only living legacy left in this house of ghosts. I held it out to her gently. "I didn't come to take anything, Mother," I said, my voice calm and clear in the sudden silence. "I just came to give you this. It's the seeds for the spring garden. It's the only thing left here that's real. I thought you might want to keep something of him alive." For a second, the room held its breath. The gesture was so simple, so undeniably pure that it cut through the artifice of the party. But Margaret couldn't let it stand. To accept the gift would be to admit that she had missed the point of her father's life. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Dirt!" she scoffed, snatching the tin from my hand. "You interrupt my party to bring me old seeds. Honestly, Emily, you are morbid." She turned and dropped the tin into the passing trash bin of a waiter, clearing empty flutes. The metal clattered against the glass, a sound of finality. "Get rid of that," she snapped at the waiter. She turned her back to me, dismissing me as if I were a fly. I stood there for one last moment looking at the back of her head, and I felt a profound sense of release. There was no saving her. She had purged the house of love, and now she had thrown away the last chance for growth. I turned and walked out the front door, the cool night air hitting my face, leaving the suffocating heat of her ego behind. As I reached the bottom of the steps, I heard her voice boom out over the microphone she had commandeered. "Ladies and gentlemen, a toast," she shouted, her voice slurring slightly with triumph. "To the future, to the Vance estate, and to new beginnings." She raised her glass of champagne to toast her new empire, unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor that was about to open. The hangover from my mother's celebration of life party hung heavy in the air of Mr. Henderson's conference room on Monday morning, though Margaret tried to hide it behind oversized sunglasses and a venti espresso. She sat at the head of the mahogany table, drumming her manicured fingernails on the leather surface, checking her watch every 30 seconds. She radiated the impatience of a woman who believed she was merely waiting for a formality to be stamped so she could return to her new kingdom. I sat quietly at the opposite end, hands folded in my lap, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight that cut across the room. When Mr. Henderson finally entered carrying a thick file and a silver iPad, Margaret didn't even let him sit down before she spoke. "Let's make this quick, Arthur," she said, her voice raspy. "I have contractors coming at noon to tear out the kitchen. Just give me the deed and the access codes to the trust accounts." Mr. Henderson sat slowly adjusting his glasses and looked at her with an expression that I can only describe as professional sorrow. He opened the file. "The deed to the manor is indeed yours, Margaret," he began, and I saw her shoulders relax in triumph. "However, the access codes you are asking for do not exist. There are no liquid assets attached to the house." Margaret froze her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. "Excuse me," she snapped. "The house is appraised at $5 million. I know the value." Mr. Henderson nodded calmly. "The market value is $5 million, yes. But the equity is zero. 2 years ago, your father took out a reverse mortgage on the property for its full appraised value. He liquidated 100% of the home's equity into cash." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret blinked her brain, struggling to compute the math. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Where did the money go? If he cashed out the house, there must be $5 million in cash somewhere. I want it." Mr. Henderson turned a page in his file. "The cash was placed into an irrevocable trust, the Marsh Development Fund, benefiting the owner of the outline property. That would be Emily." Margaret turned to look at me, her face pale, her mouth slightly open. "The mud pit," she shrieked, standing up. "He put $5 million into a swamp. That's fraud. He was senile. I'll contest it. I'll disclaim the house. I don't want a debt-ridden shell." "Sit down, Margaret." Mr. Henderson's voice was like a whip crack. "You cannot disclaim the inheritance. We warned you. By moving into the house, changing the locks, selling the antique furniture, and repainting the interior walls before probate was settled, you committed acts of ownership. Under the law, this constitutes implied acceptance. You have accepted the asset, which means you have accepted the encumbrance attached to it. The debt is yours. The mortgage payments are yours. You own the house, Margaret, and you owe the bank $5 million. Margaret collapsed back into her chair, gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly run out of oxygen. She looked at me, her eyes wild with panic. "But the swamp," she stammered. "It's worthless." I finally spoke, sliding the zoning approval letter across the table toward her. "It was worthless," I corrected her gently. "Until the city rezoned it last week. The $5 million grandfather transferred wasn't wasted. It paid for the environmental impact studies, the drainage systems, and the architectural plans for the new riverfront district. The land is debt-free, mother, and it's worth 3 times what the manor ever was." The reversal of fortune was so total, so mathematically precise that she couldn't even scream. She just sat there trembling, stripped of her victory in a matter of seconds. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. Mr. Henderson placed the iPad in the center of the table and tapped the screen. "Your father anticipated this reaction," the lawyer said softly. "He left one final message, specifically for you." The video began to play. It was grandfather sitting in his armchair wearing the same cardigan he had worn the day he died. He looked directly into the camera lens, his blue eyes sharp and clear. "Margaret." His recorded voice filled the room, echoing off the expensive wood paneling. "If you are watching this, it means you tried to take the house before I was even cold. It means you didn't wait. It means you were cruel." On screen, grandfather leaned forward. "I gave you a choice, Maggie. If you had just been kind, if you had waited, if you had treated Emily with respect, I would have torn up the mortgage documents. I kept them in the safe unsigned until the day you called me from Arizona to laugh at my death. That was the moment I signed them. You chose the house over your family. Now you have the house. I hope it keeps you warm." The screen went black. My mother stared at the blank reflection of her own face in the iPad, her mouth moving soundlessly. She realized then that this wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a legal trick. She had been tested by the man she thought was a fool, and she had failed every single question. The silence in the room was heavier than any scream. She hadn't just lost the money. She had lost the narrative of her own life. 6 months have passed since the day the truth was revealed in Mr. Henderson's office, and the seasons have turned, bringing a brutal winter back to our small town. In the end, there were no handcuffs, no dramatic police raids, and no public trials. My mother was not dragged away in chains, for that would have made her a victim in the eyes of the world, a role she would have played to perfection. Instead, she suffered a fate far more terrifying for a woman who fed on admiration and control. She became irrelevant. The housing market for sprawling, high-maintenance Victorian estates crashed just weeks after the deed was transferred to her name, leaving her trapped in a financial prison of her own design. Unable to sell the manor for a price that would cover the massive mortgage debt she had inherited, and legally bound to the property by her own acts of intermeddling, she was forced to liquidate her own assets. She sold her luxury condo, her jewelry, and her stocks just to service the monthly interest payments on the house she had stolen. I drove past the manor yesterday just to see it one last time. It stood on the hill like a bleached bone, the white paint peeling slightly in the frost. I didn't go in, but I know how she lives now. The town gossips say she keeps the heat turned off in 14 of the 15 rooms, to save money, huddled in the kitchen, with a space heater, wearing her designer coats indoors. The friends she tried to impress at her gala have long since evaporated, drifting away the moment the champagne stopped flowing. She sits alone in the echoing silence of that great empty house, surrounded by the victory she fought so hard to secure, with no audience left to applaud her. She has her castle, but she is the queen of absolutely nothing. My life, however, has bloomed in the most literal sense. I did not use the fortune from the Marsh Development Fund to buy a Ferrari or a penthouse. That kind of spending is a hole that can never be filled, a lesson my mother taught me by example. Instead, I stayed in my modest bungalow, but I bought my freedom. I quit my job at the school district and dedicated myself to the work grandfather and I had always talked about during those long afternoons in the garden. A large portion of the trust was used to establish the Arthur Vance Community Botanical Garden, located on the edge of the new Riverwalk district, right on the land my mother had called a mud pit. It is a sanctuary of native plants, walking paths, and quiet benches, a place where the elderly can sit in the sun, and where children can learn that dirt is not something to be ashamed of. Next to the gardens, I opened a small advocacy center dedicated to protecting seniors from financial exploitation. We help families navigate the complex laws of estates and trusts, ensuring that what happened to my grandfather never happens to them. Every day I walk through the gates of the garden, smelling the damp earth and the blooming jasmine, and I feel a lightness in my chest that I never knew was possible. I am surrounded by genuine friends, volunteers, neighbors, and people who knew Arthur Vance, who value me for my kindness, not my utility. I have broken the cycle of toxicity that ran through the women in my family for generations. I did not become bitter like her. I did not become greedy. I became the woman my grandfather saw when everyone else looked right through me. Sometimes when the wind blows through the river reeds, I think about the nature of revenge. For a long time, I thought justice meant seeing my mother suffer, but I realize now that grandfather's wisdom went deeper than that. He didn't leave me the money to make me rich. He left it to make me free. He didn't set the trap to hurt his daughter. He set it to reveal her. He allowed her to face the natural consequences of her own character, unshielded by his protection for the first time in her life. That is the ultimate justice, to be left alone with exactly who you are. I don't hate her anymore. I just pity her. She is trapped in a cold house with her pride, while I am out here in the warmth of the world she threw away. I walked back to my car, brushing a speck of soil from my jeans, and looked up at the clear, starry sky. In the end, my mother got the castle she always wanted, and I got the one thing she never could buy: a peaceful night's sleep. This story reminds us that true inheritance isn't about what you own, but about who you become when the world isn't watching. Now I want to turn the conversation over to you, because your perspective is the heartbeat of this channel. Do you think the punishment fit the crime? Did Margaret deserve to be left with nothing but her debt and her freezing pride? Or did you feel a moment of pity for her sitting alone in that empty house? I know many of us have had to deal with family members who mistake kindness for weakness, so I would love to read your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments section below. If Emily's journey of quiet strength and ultimate justice resonated with you, please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. By joining our community, you ensure you never miss a story about the hidden truths of family life and the satisfying moments when the mask finally slips. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and remember that sometimes the best way to win is simply to refuse to play their game.